What's the best way to follow up on one of the greatest hockey games of all time? Easy, by making an even better game. NHLPA 93 improved on the excellent game that was EA's first NHL game. The game has the sounds, the sights, and excellent control scheme of the original. And of course, this time around you have actual player names instead of just numbers. Now, if you're a critic of these sports titles, or if you're like most of the other professional video game reviewers you see on YouTube, you're probably thinking to yourself that, hey, this is just a roster update, there's nothing to see here. And that's kind of true, but it's not entirely true. The thing is, the interesting part about NHLPA 93 is that it's not licensed by the NHL, and that is a story that's worth telling. If you look closely, you'll realize that there are only city names, there are no actual team names. And all of those cool little touches like the logos on the ice and the score and stuff like that, those are all gone. Instead, all of that team-specific stuff has been replaced by generic logos. The uniforms are right, however, and the player names are all there, so it's still an improvement. Actually, my guess is that most people who played this game, both kids and adults alike, never really realized that the NHL license was missing. It's not like you spend all of your time playing these games looking at the logos. The story behind the missing NHL license goes back to before the first NHL hockey game came out. EA Sports showed off a demo of the first game to reporters covering the 1991 Stanley Cup Finals. This is what, May 1991? The story, as told by developer Michael Brooks, is that reporters at the event EA put on discovered that they could get any players to get into fights in this game, including guys like Wayne Gretzky. The NHL wanted to pull out of the agreement and stop the game, but it wound up being too late, so the league threatened to withhold its license if the fighting remained in future versions. And so EA simply ignored the NHL and its protests and went along with the next version of the game. Now, if you're wondering why the NHL cared so much about fighting, well, we've got a couple of things to get into. So yeah, fighting has always been a part of hockey, sure. What you might not know, though, is that fighting in hockey has always been very controversial, especially by those running the league. The tradition of fighting in hockey goes back to the 19th century, of course. It was sometime in 1922 that the National Hockey League officially added rules surrounding fisticuffs or fighting to its rulebook. And there was a movement underway almost immediately in certain minor leagues to try to rid the sport of all elements of fighting. Now, I'm honestly not sure how fighting became a part of hockey. There are some historians who claim that it came through rugby or something like that, but there is a problem with that. When you start tracing things back, it becomes clear that ice hockey actually evolved from field hockey, not directly from rugby. It's a completely different sporting line. Anyway, for whatever reason, fighting became synonymous with ice hockey from the beginning, and it's really been that way ever since. Tex Rickard, who rebuilt Madison Square Garden in 1925, was well known for promoting the fighting aspects of hockey. And Eddie Shore was one of the most notorious fighters in the 1920s and 30s, probably the game's first real professional antagonist. On November 23, 1929, Shore was involved in a record 5 fights in a single game and had to be carried off the ice in the end with his face covered in blood. That was against the old Montreal Maroons, and Shore was determined to be in the game a few nights later when the two teams met again. Fortunately for the 15,000 people who watched, Shore did not play in that game, but Montreal beat the Bruins 6-1 in Boston in a relatively tame game. In the end, Bruins president Charles Adams gave Shore a special $500 bonus, so much for discouraging fighting. But as most of you know, fighting in hockey is not always fun in games. It's a dangerous sport to begin with, and some of these guys would go out of their way to make it even more dangerous. One of the most notorious acts of violence in NHL history came on December 12, 1933, when Toronto visited Boston. The Bruins were off to a somewhat slow start, while the Leafs were playing tremendous hockey that season. That notoriously violent game resulted in front-page news the next day after Eddie Shore ended the career of Toronto star Ace Bailey. Now, this wasn't a fight. Instead, it was a cheap shot on Bailey from behind that was so violent that it almost killed him. It's pretty clear that Shore laid a cheap shot on Bailey and that he tried to get away with it before he was caught. Actually, Shore didn't really have much of a chance to fight. He was knocked out in one punch by Red Horner, who I'm guessing was Toronto's enforcer. While Ace Bailey somehow managed to survive, it was clearly the end of his career. And these headlines really were frightening. So as bad as it's been in the NHL from time to time, it's never really been quite as crazy as it was in the 1930s. And the thing I find really odd is that I haven't been able to find any news articles from the 30s decrying the violence in the sport. Now, nobody wants to go to a game that ends up in a bloody brawl, of course, but at the same time, nobody seemed to really mind what Eddie Shore was doing. In contrast, back in 1909, newspapers in the United States were filled with articles decrying the evils of college football. Of course, the difference is probably that dozens of people were dying every year playing college football, while on ice hockey, deaths were extremely rare. Actually, the only hockey player to die of an on-ice injury in the NHL was Bill Masterton of the old Minnesota North Stars. Masterton cracked the back of his head on the ice after rushing forward and falling and wound up being taken to the hospital where he passed away. There were still some scary incidents, though, like a preseason game in 1969 featuring Wayne Mackey and Ted Green duking it out with sticks. That incident raised cries around the league for less violence and more civility. But of course, the exact opposite happened. The game actually became more violent as it moved into the 1970s and 1980s. And it was really the 1980s which is where we saw the height of fighting in the NHL. The Philadelphia Flyers of the 1970s, known as the Broad Street Bullies, were notorious for their physical play and for getting into fights all the time. But Dave Schultz and company were not the only team getting into the act. In fact, perhaps the most famous game from that era was the Good Friday Massacre on April 20th, 1984, where the Nordiques and Canadians combined for 252 penalty minutes. This one featured one of those famous and endless brawls that involved just about everybody. Anyway, that really long tangent was to tell you that fighting really has always been an integral part of the sport, even though it's often treated as a black eye on hockey. Brawling and the unwritten code of the game has always been a big part of the way that things are, and in some respects it kind of helps protect player safety, because if you make a stupid move to injure somebody, you're going to have to pay for it. That's why there are enforcers. But there's absolutely a question about why you would want to have a hockey video game that has all of these violent fist fights in them. Gone are the days when hockey games were advertised side by side with title bouts. And in recent years, the league has done a good job at getting fights out of the game. But of course, if you're a fan of hockey video games, you absolutely have to have fighting, even if the game does a really awkward job of presenting it. And even the simplest hockey games have at least some sort of fighting mechanic, even if it is kind of comical. So when you think about it, it's a little bit ridiculous that the NHL wanted EA to completely remove all of the fighting from its game. Now, I know that the league was worried about kids causing the Great One to fight or whatever, and the thing is that there are ways in the programming to prevent crazy stuff like that from happening. But getting rid of the fighting entirely really takes a lot of the fun out of the game. One of the best parts of Blades of Steel was the fact that fighting was a strategic move. You wanted to get in fights in certain situations to possibly win a breakaway. The arcade version also featured an excellent fighting system, though it's not quite as well known as the NES Classic.
They're going at each other. Hey, pretty face. Hey, your brain damage. Kick his butt.
And of course, the voices in the arcade game are nothing short of a classic.
Right. Oh, oh, HIC.
Anyway, in the end, because of this discussion, the NHL decided not to give EA the NHL license for the 1993 game. And so, for whatever reason, EA then decided in 1994 to get rid of the fighting so it could have both licenses. Fortunately, though, we do have modified versions of NHL 94 that bring the fighting back, and big thanks to the modding community for that. Anyway, NHLPA 93 has excellent play control, it's got great sound, and it's got great graphics. It's even better than its predecessor. Sadly, you still can't shoot one-timers, though you can kind of get close. The game is a bit slower than NHL 95, NHL 96, and so on, though that's a feature for some of us, not a bug. And the biggest news with this game is that there is a Super Nintendo version. And that's not the only news, right? The huge part is that the Super Nintendo version is actually good. It's not awful. Compare it to, say, the first Super Nintendo version of John Madden Football, which is unplayable. I mean, just look at this game. The frame rate is so bad that it's absolutely unplayable. Now, there are still frame rate issues with the Super Nintendo version of NHLPA 93, sure. But this game is a lot better than that Madden game, and it is actually a lot of fun to play. EA did an excellent job with this game the first time around. Anyway, while you don't see the same vibrant community around NHLPA 93 that you see for NHL 94, it still is a really good game. And if you want to play a great cartridge version of the old school EA hockey games that has fighting and a little bit of violence, some blood in the Genesis version, this is the one you really want to go for. Of course, at the time, the reviewers absolutely loved this game. Computer Gaming World reviewed this game for some reason or other and called it one of the best action-oriented sports games of all time. GamePro gave the Sega Genesis version an absolutely stellar review. I think that this rating says it all. This is simply an amazing game. It's an all-time classic. The Super NES version also got a positive review, though the reviewer noted the frame rate issues. And as you can see in these ratings, the Super Nintendo version has an issue with the sound. And honestly, I do agree with those ratings. I mean, the Genesis version is fantastic. Super Nintendo version is good, but yeah, the sound sucks. There are problems with the Super Nintendo and how it handled sound, and the frame rate's an issue. Like, the thing is, though, that this is a great game, even though there are no one-timers. Now, the Super NES version will drive you nuts if you play it a long time with the frame rate issues, and you can check that out on this channel if you want. I did a mini-series. But the Genesis version truly is an all-time classic. And if you haven't played it yet, well, what are you waiting for? Go give it a try.